Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now if there's one company that likes to take full advantage of AMD's latest integrated graphics, it's Minisforum, and we've certainly looked at plenty of their mini machines over the past couple of years. The one I have here is the UM890 Pro. This one has a Ryzen 9 8945HS 8-core 16-thread processor and is specced with 32 gigs of 5600MHz dual-channel DDR5, as well as a 1TB M.2 PCIe 4.0 SSD. There's support for 96 gigs of RAM total, as well as space for 2 SSDs. Of course, we also have the Radeon 780M graphics built in, and this is going to be the last time we look at them for a while. Because of this, I wanted to really push this little beast, so we're covering path tracing, ray tracing and 4K or 2160p gaming all in this video. I plan to add an external GPU to this in the future because unlike its predecessor, the UM790 Pro, this one has an Oculink port, the adapter for which is included in the box. While we're on the subject of ports, we also have two 2.5G Ethernet ports, HDMI 2.1, DisplayPort 1.4, USB 4, USB 3.2 audio jack, and of course power in. As per usual, this tiny Ryzen powered computer is very snappy for everyday tasks within Windows 11, but it's the gaming side of things I'm always interested in most of all. The first thing I like to do is jump into the BIOS and enable performance mode. I could set the amount of dedicated VRAM here too if I wanted, anywhere up to 16 gigs in this case, or it can be left at auto. We've covered gaming with the 780M a few times, but before pushing the settings and resolutions even higher, let's look at the UM890 Pro in action with the Ryzen 8945HS and iGPU, because it's still impressive. That said, and as expected, some sacrifices may need to be made depending on the game you want to play. Not all of them though. So first up we have Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p with the lowest settings and FSR 2.1 set to quality for 59 FPS on average. Not quite 60 here, although the game did exceed it in those less busy areas. The 1% low was 40 and the 0.1% low was 30. For Spider-Man at 1080p with the low preset and TAA, we saw 55 FPS on average. Again, just like in Cyberpunk really, if you're happy with closer to 30 FPS, then you could certainly turn the settings up. 43 was the 1% low here and the 0.1% figure was 27. Fallout 4 with the medium preset and TAA gave us 76 FPS with a 1% low of 51 and a 0.1% low of 30. This was definitely one of the better results of today, especially as we were running around downtown here, which is known to be one of the more intensive in-game areas. Counter-Strike 2 with the lowest settings, which I feel is best for online and competitive shooters such as this, returned an average of 142, a 1% low of 85 and a 0.1% low of 63. Now for Starfield we did require some sacrifice. Not only did we have to enable FSR 3, but we had to set the resolution scale to 80%. In return, we saw 30 FPS in and around Aquila. This figure did jump up a little when we were just exploring the face of different planets. It depends on where you are in this vast map, of course, but overall this did better than I anticipated. Grand Theft Auto 5 performed nicely with the high settings, sliders halfway and FXAA with 80 FPS, 1% low of 62 and a 0.1% low of 25. Our penultimate result is Elden Ring with the low preset and AA set to high. 50 FPS was more than playable with this preset, and the 1% low of 41 followed by the 0.1% low of 23 meant that things weren't too inconsistent. It was certainly a decent enough experience. Finally, we have The Witcher 3 1080p medium for an average of 55. The 1% number was 40 and the 0.1% was 33. As you can see by the on-screen figures here, the temperature is staying between 60 and 70 degrees most of the time, sometimes a little less. And in terms of power consumption, well, it's between 60 and 70 watts in performance mode here. We can also see the GPU boosting to its max 2800 MHz clock speed. Of course, this modern iGPU also supports ray tracing, though as you can imagine, FSR support really saves the day, especially if we want to go even further and enable path tracing too. Cyberpunk 2077 is perfect for testing both, and although we do have to make some pretty hefty adjustments, it's amazing to think that this is possible without a discrete graphics card in 2024. I can't wait to see what the next generation of onboard graphics can do as part of little systems like this as well. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. Now when it came to Cyberpunk, I actually kept all the settings at low apart from ray tracing, which I set to ultra. Everything was turned up here. As you can see, we're still exceeding 30 FPS. I did also have to implement FSR 2.1 and set it to ultra performance mode. So as you can imagine, not the crispest of, is that word crispiest? Not the crispiest of visuals. I guess not as sharp as some of you may like to see, but I was pretty surprised by this result, impressed as well, to be fair. The power consumption is still between 60 and 70 watts for the unit, and in terms of temperature, we're looking at about 70 degrees or just under most of the time here. I then thought, why don't I just turn on path tracing? This is the next step up from ray tracing in terms of how demanding it is and of course how it looks. Now, to start with, I opted for 1080p with FSR 2.1 set to ultra performance. And as you can imagine, although the game looked fantastic, we weren't exactly getting a playable frame rate. It was well below 20 FPS a lot of the time. Sometimes we were seeing low teens in terms of those numbers. I'm talking 13, 14 FPS in the busier parts of Night City. I mean, we had to make a pretty hefty sacrifice in order to see at least 30 FPS. I had to maintain ultra performance FSR as well as turn the native res to 720p. So we're upscaling from like 360p, possibly 240p here, and it certainly shows. We can see some of the effects that path tracing brings to the table, but to be honest, you have to ask yourself, is it worth playing like this for the sake of a few impressive reflections? Some may say yes, and in terms of getting a good screenshot, it certainly is, but when actually playing, well, having to run at upscaled 240 or 360p doesn't look the best, and it's not going to be ideal for those more intensive in-game missions as well, when you need to see a lot of what's going on screen, because this is pretty blurry. Before we see if this thing can handle 4K or 2160p, as a lot of you would rather me refer to it as, let's talk about frame generation, which can sometimes offer a very mixed bag of results. Some older or weaker hardware can make use of FSR3 and frame gen, but there might be graphical issues or performance that ends up being worse. This is definitely something I've experienced in the past. I was actually concerned with how games would feel to play with this hardware with frame gen turned on, especially in cases where we may have been getting inconsistent or sub 60 FPS results to start with. I also have some personal concerns with frame gen as a whole. I do worry that some developers will implement it as an alternative to actually optimizing their games, but that's a totally different talking point. One best saved for another day. Anyway, what I will say is that in the games I tested it in, Starfield and Spider-Man, it felt very good to use. Starfield averaged around 30 FPS with 80% res scale with this system when frame gen was disabled, but turning it on saw that performance figure, or perceived performance figure, increase to 54. I did anticipate a sluggish feel to this game or input lag that was quite unbearable, but in my opinion it felt fine. Spider-Man also saw a nice perceived performance boost from below 60 FPS to at least 70. This definitely felt better than Starfield. The higher frame rate and third-person perspective, I think, helped when frame gen was enabled, and in situations like this, with hardware like this, I can see what I'd call the true potential of frame gen in action. I still have my previously voiced concerns, of course, but the end result in these two examples was solid. As I've said before, I'd take a fully custom gaming PC build any day, but I can still very much appreciate products like the UM890 Pro here. The low power consumption, quiet operation and space saving aspect are all appealing. Combine that with respectable gaming performance, albeit with the help of supported upscaling techniques on some occasions, and the world of tiny PCs is only getting more exciting. But now, let's try 4K. Older games are your best bet, so let's start with some classics. The Elder Scrolls Oblivion 2160p with a higher preset returned an average of 80 FPS, a 1% low of 51 and a 0.1% low of 30. Half-Life 2, I'm not even convinced I had this set to 2160p because we were seeing over 250 FPS. It could just be the level we were playing though, because we're in the middle of water. I mean, there's not that much going on, but a pretty astronomical frame rate on average 265 with a 1% low and 0.1% figure that both stayed above 60 at 4K. So I know the game's old, but it still holds up pretty well visually in my opinion, and it's nice to see it running well at 4K with no discrete graphics card. We have the legendary GTA San Andreas next, 2160p with the highest settings for 90 FPS. Excuse the wobbly cars, I haven't reinstalled some of my mods that fixed some of the PC problems, but there we are. Still performs well, 65 FPS is that 1% figure, and the 0.1% low is 58. Let's go a little more modern now then, and we'll start with GTA 5. At 2160p with the normal settings and the detail sliders set halfway, with FXAA we saw 42 frames per second. I took a little drive around downtown Los Santos and the game remained pretty consistent. Our 1% low was 30 and our 0.1% was 25. Fallout 4, now this was a bit of a mess and it's a good example of what you may need to do in some instances if you're willing to sacrifice the graphics for the sake of a higher resolution, and that is capping the frame rate, because uncapped 2160p 32 FPS was the average, but I mean it's pretty messy. That 0.1% low was 8 FPS, so stutters all over the place. Using Reaver Tuner to cap the frame rate at 30 actually smoothed this right out. We were seeing 30 FPS as an average with a 1% low of 25 and a 0.1% low of 24, so this eliminated most of the issues I was having with this game and made Fallout 4, well, what I would call playable at 2160p, though you do have to ask yourself, is the bump in resolution worth the visual sacrifices that come along with the lower presets? Of course, I just wanted to test it out to see if the system could handle it, and it's doing alright so far. Counter-Strike 2, well, this actually ran at 60 FPS on average with the lowest settings. I tend to run this at the lowest settings anyway because it's an online competitive game. We saw 45 FPS as that 1% figure and a 0.1% low of 40, so overall not bad at all. Skyrim Special Edition, I guess, is similar to Fallout 4 in that you're going to be seeing between 30 and 40 FPS, but this time around we didn't have any stutter issues really, so I felt that this was best played uncapped. It's not going to reach the default 60 FPS cap. Anyway, we're going to see 37 on average here, but the 1% low was 25 and the 0.1% low was 24, so this is really smooth, to be honest. Forza Horizon 4 now, this is back in the Steam most played list because it's on sale currently and I think it's getting delisted in December, so get it while you can. This ran really well. I definitely could have turned up the preset. I stuck with very low, and at 4K it still looked pretty good at very low, but I think we could have easily squeezed medium out of this for at least 30 FPS. This is basically the introductory level, but it gives us a good idea of multi-competitor race performance, and we were seeing 55 overall with consistent percentile lows. Finally, we have Fortnite with performance mode. It ran fine in DX 11 and 12 modes with the low settings, but as an online competitive game, I decided to try and squeeze the most out of this at this resolution, and at 2160p with 100% 3D res, everything else set to lowest and the performance API enabled, we saw 103 frames per second. It wasn't without its faults in terms of stutter, however, which is sometimes the case anyway with this one. But there we go. This is going to be the last look at 780M graphics here on the channel for a while. I'll test this machine with an Oculink eGPU at some point as well. For now though, this has been the UM890 Pro from Minisforum. I've had fun testing out frame gen, high resolutions, and of course ray and path tracing too. I'll leave a link below to this on the Minisforum page if you want to check it out, and all that's left to say is thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you all again next time.